In this video we are going to take a look at the basics of building a Deathwatch army list aimed at beginners. This is the updated version of my previous guide released about a year ago. Since then, a ton has changed, and this new version includes the recently released War Zone Nephilim, as well as any relevant rules and points changes for Deathwatch to this day. First, we will quickly look at what rules are relevant for building our first list. Second, we will go through two important preparation steps that help with building our list. After that, we will dive right into army building itself with a 4-step approach that I usually take when building my own army lists. Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Temmer, and I will be guiding you through this video. Before we dive into army building itself, first a quick look at the rules that will provide the framework for building our army. Basically, there are 3 ways to play Warhammer 40k: open, narrative and match. The so-called match play is to be considered the most balanced way to play Warhammer 40k. It is also the most restrictive one, and the one you can expect to find in a competitive environment. For a general introduction, I recommend reading page 279 in the 9th edition core rulebook, followed by a short overview on page 280. What is important for our army building is that we must pick a battle size, as well as organizing our army into detachments. The most commonly played battle size is the strike force at 2000 points. While it can be tempting to go lower as a beginner without access to a lot of models, it is worth noting that armies are generally balanced around 2k points. While 1k or even 1.5k have become a bit more popular with 9th edition, there has been no big breakthrough on these lower point-sized games yet, and as such I doubt that we will see it happen during the remainder of this edition. Therefore, what I do recommend even for beginners is to familiarize with both matched play and 2k points as soon as possible. Though if you are a bunch of regulars learning the game together, dropping lower in points as you build up your armies shouldn't be an issue. If anything, this will make the games shorter and allow you to get more reps in, which is especially important for Deathwatch, as we will see over the course of this video. For the purposes of this video, we are focusing on building an army for match play with a strike force up to 2k points, organized into a single battalion detachment for the Deathwatch faction. While it is possible to take different detachments and or even multiple ones, sticking to this single detachment is in my opinion the most straightforward approach to building up your fresh Deathwatch army. The recent release of War Zone Nephilim has also made drastic changes to how many command points we get prior to the game, effectively halving them, which further discourages taking multiple detachments. With the rules covered, moving on to preparations. There are 2 things worth mentioning here. First, it is far easier to build an army list with an army building tool. 2 popular ones are Battlescribe, which is unofficial and free of charge, and the official Warhammer 40k app, developed by Games Workshop, which has an included army builder called Battleforge. While Battlescribe in general is the more accurate tool and being used by most competitive players, the developer has gone missing for quite a while now, and basically it is the community just updating the data files at this point. Unfortunately, GW has still not managed to get their own app to a similar level of reliability, and as such, I would recommend using Battlescribe, though it would make sure to stick to the free version, given the state of development. It is likely that somewhere in the future, the community will move on to another third-party alternative that still has its creator support. The second point I wish to cover is the importance of having a plan when starting to build up your list. As a complete beginner, this is of course easier said than done, and I remember only too well that rules float, army building tools and the GT mission format with the secondaries can be completely overwhelming. As such, I will be briefly touching on the required rules, the Deathwatch Army of Renown and the mission format, including secondary objectives. But no worries, I will keep this one brief to give an overview of where you will be headed later. As far as the rules are concerned, you require the core rulebook, the Space Marine Codex and the Deathwatch supplement. The latter only contains the Deathwatch specific rules and datasheets, but we do get access to most regular Space Marine datasheets, and we can also use relics, warlord traits and stratagems from the main codex. Therefore, it is important to have access to both books. In addition to this, we have received the so-called Army of Renown in War Zone Nephilim. The corresponding rules can be found in Book 1, Rising Tide. For all these book releases, there are so-called FAQs with clarifications and sometimes entire rule changes available for free on the Warhammer community website. There you can also find the Monitorum Field Manual for free, which includes the updated points for all datasheets, as well as the so-called Balance Data Slate, which is basically another layer of balance, updated quarterly. Finally, you need the War Zone Nephilim Grand Tournament Mission Pack for the most updated version of missions and secondaries. That's quite a pile of rules, hence my previous comment about rules bloat. Overall, the important takeaway from this is for one that there are updated rules and points to the printed books, and point 2 would be that while Battlescribe is fairly accurate, when in doubt, it is always best to fall back to the actual books and FAQs to figure out what exactly applies. As I mentioned earlier, the Deathwatch has an Army of Renown, the Kill Team Strike Force, with special rules and restrictions. It is very thematic, highly competitive, but also quite difficult to play. As a beginner, the additional layer of rules on top of the already complex Deathwatch rules can be overwhelming, though there are of course dedicated souls that want to go all in from the start. Shout out to my patron Philip. But anyway, my general advice would be to start with a regular list and then adapt it to the Army of Renown once you got a couple of games in. Therefore, we will be looking into a non-Army of Renown list in this video with a focus on competitive models that can still be used once you decide to go for the Army of Renown. I will be doing a separate beginner video for the Kill Team Strike Force in the near future. Last and certainly not least, we have the GT mission format and secondaries. 9th edition created a major shift here when compared to older editions by moving away from two armies just grinding each other to dust and instead focusing towards scoring primary and secondary points through holding so-called mission objectives and completing secondary objectives. The latter can be particularly difficult for beginners, as you must choose 3 of them, and that can be quite overwhelming. Unfortunately, Deathwatch has no set auto-includes, but we have several good options nonetheless. In a nutshell, there are separate categories of secondaries, and you can only pick one of each. The Long Vigil from Battlefield Supremacy is quite decent if you can keep your deployment zone clear. Stranglehold is a good alternative to that, as Deathwatch is strong at the objective game anyway, thanks to the kill teams counting as troops. Shadow Operations has several good options too: raise the banners high, deploy teleport homers, or the Deathwatch specific cripple stronghold among them. Last and not least, you will likely want some kill stuff secondary, as that's what we are doing anyway. Here you could pick no prisoners, grind them down, suffer not the alien when facing Xenos, or just a generic Oaths of Moment for Space Marines. If this sounds overly overwhelming, and you'll be playing among beginners anyway, one idea is also to just skip secondaries for the first few games and focusing on the primary objectives and getting to know your armies. For the purposes of this video, I designed a list with the previously mentioned secondaries in mind, but I also wanted to make sure that there is not too much rules overload and that the list is offering a fun playing experience with decent enough models. With this lengthy introduction out of the way, let's finally dig into the list building itself. Having set up our army building tool and selected our Deathwatch battalion detachment, what I always do is starting with what I consider the auto-includes. Now, auto-includes are commonly referred to strong picks for a faction, but I don't exclusively mean just that. An auto-include can also be a new model you absolutely want to bring along, and or units that work particularly well in the kind of environment you play. For me personally, I have the following auto-includes. My first auto-include is the Phobos Librarian. I put the Phobos variant for this list because of the second pick that will follow right after this one, but in general, you can also run a slightly more expensive librarian with a jump pack instead. Either way, what makes this one an auto-include is the Deathwatch Xenopurge discipline with 2 powers fortified with contempt and primorphic resonance. Always take these. If you can spare points for the chief upgrade, that one is great as well, with Mantle of Shadow as the 3rd power. For this list, I am also giving the Librarian the Lord of Deceit Warlord trait, to which I will get in just a moment. My next auto-include is of course the Spectre's kill team, consisting out of 5 infiltrators, one of which is the Helix Adept, and 5 eliminators with Las Fuzils. I have been running these guys pretty much since the start of 9th edition, and they have only gotten better over time, with eliminators now being a bargain at 25 points, with Armor of Contempt making them super tanky on top, and generally, this kill team is now amazing with the new missions and secondaries. The main idea here is to always combat squad these guys. The most common way to do it is 4 eliminators with 1 Helix Adept, but you can also spread the eliminators more evenly. At least 1 infiltrator needs to be in each combat squad, as you get 2 deep strike denial bubbles like that. One other thing to consider is that even though they can be deployed with concealed positions, it doesn't necessarily mean that you must do it. A common mistake I have seen in the past is that people have deployed too aggressively and then basically invited the opponent to get an easy first turn charge that would otherwise not have been possible. Here is where the Lord of Deceit Warlord trait on the Librarian comes in handy, allowing you to redeploy all your 3 Phobos units, both combat squads and the Librarian, after who goes first has been decided. You can safely deploy super aggressively, and or screw up deploying these in general, and then still correct that later. Another way to use them is to screen out your deployment zone. This is very handy when you are going for the long vigil as a secondary. Lastly, you can also go with the sniper loadout on the eliminators, same points, and especially when facing other beginners, the prospect of snipers often makes opponents play overly defensive. Personally, I prefer the Las Fuzils, but for instance if you got the easy to build models from the combat patrol, they only got the sniper loadout, and there is no need to get new models with Las Fuzils in that case. Moving on to the 3rd one, the Primaris Chaplain on bike. This is just an amazing HQ overall. Durable, great buffs and fast movement. The Phobos Librarian aside, this one is also great for putting the Beacon and Chalice on, which is what we are doing in this list. You also want to upgrade this one to a Master of Sanctity, which really helps with getting his litanies off. Speaking of relics and traits, as far as CP is concerned, Space Marine have great many relics and warlord traits, and as a result, the new War Zone Nephilim CP changes really hurt us, as we can pre-invest far less than we used to. Looking at our 3 picks so far, we now have the fast-moving Chaplain, able to beacon pull a kill team, and we have the super flexible deployment from the Phobos units with Lord of Deceit. With my personal auto-includes done, I'm now looking at getting the detachment requirements out of the way. For the battalion, we need to include a minimum of 2 HQs and 3 troops. While some armies might think of this as a troop tax, for the Deathwatch this is a non-issue, with our kill teams counting as a troop's choice. But it is not strictly required to include kill teams in a Deathwatch army. It is one of the unique features of the faction, and in general I strongly recommend doing so. With the Spectres being primarily a utility pick, what we want now is some heavy hitters. For this, I recommend taking 3 more kill teams, up to a total of 4 for this list. I will go through these 3 kill teams only briefly. For a full guide to kill team interactions and competitive loadouts, feel free to check my kill team guides linked in the description. First, we have the infamous Indomitor Blob, this one consisting out of the 5 mandatory heavy intercessors, 3 Boltstorm aggressors, as well as 2 Bolter Inceptors. Why 3-2 and not 4-1, as more commonly seen in competitive lists? The answer here is simple. When you are freshly starting out, you'll get aggressors and inceptors as triplets. This way, you only need 1 box of aggressors and 1 box of inceptors, or either as part of a combat patrol, and you are already set. I also gave them the Aquila specialism to help get familiar with that mechanic, as this will be paramount later in an Army of Renown list. But anyway, this is a durable kill team that can be pulled into a position with the Beacon and Chalice if needed, And if you are adding the librarians fortified with contempt on top of an extra cover save, they are excellent for bullying the midboard with. They do have more overall shooting, but the power fists on the aggressors are not to be underestimated. Anyway, to bolster this kill team further, I added a Chief Apothecary with Selfless Healer to the list, allowing you to heal wounds, bring a dead model back for free, and in case the Librarian fails his cast, you'll have a backup Feel No Pain save. This is the one kill team that is best played without using combat squads. We then have two Proteus kill teams, the backbone of many competitive lists and the proof that Firstborn are not dead. One version is the Clangby style kill team, which is the 2.0 version of the infamous Costello style kill team, basically a close combat murder brick featuring a lot of hammers. This one is quite difficult to master as a beginner, especially the movement and staying in coherency, but it is one of the most devastating close combat options we have available. Basically, whatever you point this at is likely to die. What I recommend here is to check out my guide to the practical approach to the Proteus kill team, where I am covering this kill team in greater detail. As a final note, this kill team could make use of combat squads, in which case you are splitting the hammers off with the bike, but it really depends on what you're facing. As the fourth and last kill team, we then have the so-called infantry bikes, where we are using two vanvets to give the three veteran bikers the infantry keyword, which lets them interact with terrain as such, while keeping their high mobility. For this to work, this kill team needs to combat squad, and the 5 default vets can be used to guard an objective or do actions, for instance. The Vanvet biker half of the kill team can also punch a bit thanks to power swords and claws. You could also go for swords over claws on the Vanvets for the same points. I think that with the recent addition of Armor of Contempt, the claws have fallen a bit behind against several popular armies. From this point on, the battalion requirements have easily been met, as we have 2 out of 2 HQs and 4 out of 3 mandatory troops, and we can now proceed to fill up the remaining points. One or the other may have noticed the lack of a captain or watchmaster. While I do consider these very good picks, and I have added a captain to this list, I would also argue that unless you are bringing along plasma loadouts on Inceptors or Hellblasters and want to overcharge, the Librarian and Chaplain should be prioritized. This is something to consider when playing at lower points. Either way, I am keeping the Captain cheap here, with the biker version at 100 points, giving us the reroll aura, a big base to spread it properly, mobility to get it where it needs to be, and decent survivability with the T5. Can't go wrong with this one. What I would then go for next is a selection of what is generally perceived as strong Space Marine unit picks, but I think as it currently stands in 9th edition, we are a bit at an impasse here. As I initially mentioned, our Army of Renown is the most competitive way to play, our kill teams count among the best troops available to Space Marines. As a result, there are very few generic datasheets that are worth abandoning either of these for. What comes to mind are Dreadnoughts, Assault Centurions and Blade Guard Veterans. Looking at roughly 350 points, you could put the combination of 2 out of 3 or even 2 times 1 datasheet in, but any such choices will be excluded from the Army of Renown. For the purposes of this list, I decided to go with a Redemptor Dreadnought and a squad of Eradicators. Why a Redemptor if we cannot include it in an Army of Renown? Originally, my idea had been to put a Corvus Blackstar instead, which is iconic, decent and playable in the kill team strike force. But from a beginner's perspective, I also think that it's difficult to play. In contrast, the Redemptor is a cool model, included in the Combat Patrolled Archangels, which is a good starting point for Deathwatch anyway, and relatively easy to play. You can just move it up the board, especially when facing beginners. They will either overcommit or not deal with it fast enough. Win-win. For more information on why Redemptors are amazing in the Deathwatch, check out my guide linked in the description. If you don't mind its AOR incompatibility, go for that one. If you prefer the best looking flyer in the game that you might lose turn 1 instead, then the Corvus Blackstar it is. Furthermore, being able to bring a separate squad of Eradicators is another advantage of non-Army of Renown lists, and putting these into the Teleportarium is a great way to deploy them where they need to be as your dedicated anti-tank. As a fourth and final step, I would fill up the list or trim down points as needed. In this case, I was a handful of points over and needed to adjust some war gear, but depending on the actual list, this is basically where you could add or remove a specialism or two, or squeeze in a cheap unit like a separate eliminator squad, depending on what points still allow. Last but not least, if you want to turn this into an Army of Renown list, you simply kick out the Redemptor Corvus and the Eradicators and go with the 5th kill team and specialisms upgrades on all of them, and that's about it. All in all, while aimed at beginners, this list capitalizes on several Deathwatch core elements. The durable Indomitor plus support characters for contesting the midboard, the fast chaplain for litanies and the beacon, flexible deployment with the Phobos units, screening out your backfield for Deathwatch secondary play, a close combat murder brick, the mobile infantry bikes and some wet action monkeys, not to mention the dedicated anti-tank in the shape of Eradicators that can be deployed through the Teleportarium, and whatever final flex pick you decide to go for. This list can also easily be adjusted to an Army of Renown later, and I recommend being on the lookout for my beginner's guide to the Kill Team Strike Force, which I will be releasing in the near future. If all of this sounds overly overwhelming still, nothing wrong with getting a few deathmatch style practice games in with a beginner friend, and move on to more dedicated mission play later on. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the basics of list building, aiming for a matched play Strike Force army at 2k points, which is a great mid to long term goal even for beginners. Picking a battalion detachment for the Deathwatch synergizes well with our kill teams counting as troops, and it is the recommended way to go now that War Zone Nephilim has cut our starting CP in half. Before getting started with the actual list, picking an army builder tool and having a plan for playing the GT missions is essential, though especially the latter can be overwhelming for beginners. While we have briefly touched some of the general concepts, one alternative is also to take it one step at a time and playing a few initial practice games with a limited set of rules, for instance not picking secondaries and not playing the Deathwatch Army of Renown. How I personally go about building a list is that I start with the auto-includes, which are the units I absolutely want to have in this specific list. I then proceed by meeting the battlefield role requirements, which are 3 troops and 2 HQ slots for a battalion detachment. For a somewhat balanced list, I try to get a good mix out of both ranged and close combat units, which I want to be primarily kill teams, and then complement them with support and utility that adds both to their offense as well as defense. I then proceed to add units that fill any potential gaps still present in the list, or tweak some war gear or give or take a specialism. So that's it for building a Deathwatch army list for beginners. Any additional advice from the more veteran viewers, and how do newcomers feel about starting with the Army of Renown right away? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated, as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.